I can annoy people. Trolls. I hate those guys. But if I'm going to teach Agentic AI, I'm going to have to stick to my guns. It's me and my swarms against people shouting at me on the internet. And if I'm genuinely in the wrong, I'm happy to hear it. But some of this stuff is maths. It's true no matter what the trolls say. This is a special segment all about taking a stand and laying out my position on something that I'm just not easily going to give up on. Because this, my friends, this is the hill I will die on. All right. I've had enough of repeating myself in every online forum fight about this. So it's time to set the record straight about large language models and where they sit on the deterministic versus stochastic thing. So first things first, what do these two words mean? They both describe a quality of a system. A system is stochastic if it involves the generation of a random number to work. A system is deterministic if it only involves the execution of non-random rules. The classic example of a stochastic system is tossing a coin, although for reasons we'll touch on briefly, even that is actually contentious. For a deterministic system, let's go with the age-old programmer's friend, the hello world test code. One is a simple flip of chance. The other is a simple execution of a rule. Because of this example, many people, especially it appears in IT, equate stochastic with difficult to predict and deterministic with the opposite. Except, given how much sci-fi IT people tend to watch, you would think more of us would wonder about something that is probably more popular than ever right now. The three-body problem. There's a whole Netflix series about how impossible the accurate prediction of a three-gravitational body system is. And yet, everything about the three-body problem is entirely, in fact perfectly, deterministic. So, what gives? Well, maybe JC rigged it. Maybe I've picked one outlier that makes this more complicated than it needs to be. Let's use another common example. The game of poker versus the game of chess. Now, poker isn't perfectly stochastic. It mostly is because of the shuffling, but it also has elements of human interaction and certain rules that aren't random at all. So it's not as random as a coin flip, but it's still on the left side. Similarly, chess has no random rules at all. But the actual playing of the game involves human decisions, which will often not be as clinical as literally executing a rule table. But it's still firmly on the right side. Again, people can argue that a chess game is inherently easier to predict than a game of poker, right? Especially if we just focus on the next few turns. Yeah, but now explain this. Tic-tac-toe is basically exactly as deterministic as chess is. Do you feel like telling Magnus Carlsen his games are as easy to predict as noughts and crosses? Likewise, blackjack is more stochastic than poker is because it really is just flipping cards from a shuffled deck. And yet, there are movies about how susceptible it is to prediction from card counting. So far, it's really not taking me much effort at all to blow a hole straight through this flawed assumption that stochastic means unpredictable and deterministic means the opposite. So what's going on? It's not actually a crazy idea to intuitively equate randomness with unpredictability, yeah? And of course, no, it's not. But I would say the bigger issue is assuming it's the only source of unpredictability. There's actually a whole additional axis we need to talk about, the difference between ordered or regular systems and chaotic or complex ones. Because it turns out that just because a system has no true randomness does not mean it's easy to predict. Unpredictability is more like a two-dimensional spectrum across this more nuanced space. In fact, unpredictability fills up most of the quadrants. It's only the relatively small area of ordered deterministic systems, like computer programming code, that routinely give us ease of prediction, which helps explain why so many IT folks are losing sleep about large language models. If we map the previous examples to this two-dimensional grid, we get some explanations. Poker probably is the hardest to predict of the games we gave as examples. It's the combination of the game's complex states, as well as the shuffling that puts it ahead of blackjack and coin toss. Likewise, there's no way chess is as predictable as tic-tac-toe. The complexity of the game space alone is what gives chess its reputation as a master's game. Let's stake out the other corners of the grid just to prove this out further. In the bottom left corner, we have quantum decay. Now, this is what we think might be the closest the universe gets to a very basic system that is also fundamentally random. Literally how quantum states break down. On the far left, but nearly in the realms of complex systems, is Brownian motion, the way microscopic particles move in liquid. Up the far top right is our friend the three-body problem again, the pinnacle of deterministic chaos and its unpredictability. And that one in the deep red top left is called stochastic turbulence. Basically, God mode maths for modeling liquids. I've also added some more complex programming systems like finite state machines and Perlin noise, a function used in video games to make, quote, random patterns, even though it's totally deterministic. And here's about another half dozen to really bring the point home. In particular, though, I want you to pay close attention to that top right quadrant. That's actually where I'm driving with this whole thing, and where most of my other videos will focus, a little place called the edge of chaos. This is where Ian Malcolm from Jurassic Park hangs out, along with my friends, the cellular automata, and artificial life. This is the world of fractals and physics, but the whole way we've learned to map it is by using computers, not dice. My contention? This is where the large language models live, until we mess with them. Let's get properly specific now about what actually defines a more chaotic system. This is an area of mathematics where very tiny changes have big impacts, so we need to get the definition right from the start. The best yardstick I can find in the current literature to define this strongly is the quality of divergence, how quickly and dramatically a system diverges or branches from its initial states, how surprising it is, or how sensitive it appears to be, to very small changes in those initial conditions. The more a system unexpectedly diverges from a more linear path, the more complex or chaotic it is. The next Agentic workshop episode is called Langton's Life, and it's centered on a beautiful little program called Langton's Ant. The program isn't much longer than the code needed for a Hello World test, but the behavior of the ant has dramatically surprising outcomes which vary massively, depending on tiny changes to the starting conditions. Both programs are pretty much entirely deterministic, yet it becomes nearly impossible to write a simple equation to predict some long-run pattern output of the ant given a certain starting input. It's just that chaotic. But wait, there's even more math words. We actually can't properly talk about randomness in a stochastic system without digging a little deeper. There are actually two main sources of uncertainty which can lead to a system being characterized as random. The much more common source is called epistemic uncertainty. Basically, uncertainty due to our lack of or imperfect knowledge, our inability to precisely measure or to properly and fully understand a system can leave us with no choice but to consider it stochastic. Error tolerances on machinery are a good example of this, and one we'll come back to. And there's a second type of uncertainty, a word you really can trot out at parties to get noticed: aleatory uncertainty. The word comes from Latin. You may have heard the phrase alea iacta est, which means the die is cast. Aleatory refers to true randomness, something that is random because its very nature makes it so. Things like quantum decay or Brownian motion are examples often cited here. However, there's weirdly a bit of a tension in this thinking. See, technically a dice being rolled is just a complex demonstration of Newtonian physics. If we could slow down time and through a whole bunch of computer power and a high-resolution camera at it, we could theoretically predict which number the die would land on perfectly, because it would actually be deterministic. So our inability to do that is technically due to our lack of knowledge, which should make dice rolls a source of epistemic uncertainty rather than aleatory, even though dice are literally what it's named after. So yeah, it's a little silly, in my opinion, to be overly eager to classify anything in computer science as truly stochastic, because mathematicians have been getting in barb rolls over this classification since long before ChatGPT. For now, though, let's use these words with a purpose. Epistemic uncertainty appearing stochastically, we will regard as randomness due to error or lack of understanding. Aleatory will be when we know we're deliberately introducing random numbers to the mix, or that the fundamental process is inherently random. So let's make it real with some examples again. The two games of coin toss and tic-tac-toe are almost perfectly separated by the introduction of aleatory uncertainty. They have almost the same level of system regularity, especially if, like a good Aussie, you only play 2 up. But there's literally no random event in tic-tac-toe, although your siblings might feel like they are. A really good example for our purposes of epistemic uncertainty is a phenomenon known as algorithmic non-determinism. Note the very careful use of language there, not algorithmic stochasticity, just non-determinism. Basically, our computers are pretty advanced, but they won't stop a cosmic gamma ray. Also, the speed of light is a thing, as is time and other pesky physical constraints. When dealing with the very, very small world of microprocessing, these extremely hard to predict edge case physical conditions can cause a bit inside an information system to flip from 1 to 0, or for two operations to arrive at the exact same split second and resolve in a borderline tiebreak that won't easily be repeatable. Right? Now, cosmic rays don't roll dice, and the wiring in our circuit boards isn't flipping coins. But this stuff is so impossibly hard for us to measure and manage that we basically have to write them off as a statistical error rate. There's a probability that at any given moment, something will not quite run the exact same way as it did in the past.
Okay, so now let's set your Wayback Machine to 2018 and a little thing called GPT-1. Well, technically it was just GPT, but you get the idea. Straight out of the gate, we called these things a large language model, right? For a reason. These were complex systems by default. Not only that, their behavior was enormously sensitive to starting conditions. So I'm plotting this straight into the chaotic space, but I'm going to leave a little room. I'm not able to be super precise on how the LLMs map to our previous examples, but that's not as important as how they move around these quadrants. So LLMs were complex systems, even from GPT-1. What's more contentious for people is why I'm putting it so far on the right-hand side. But I'll get to that next. You might have heard people talk about the size of each new model. There's a thing called the parameter count. It's basically how many individual elements of the system there are. Remember, just making a bigger or more complicated system doesn't always mean more chaotic. But in this case, it absolutely does. As the models scale, they become more nuanced in their understanding and more specific in their responses. In other words, they become more and more sensitive to starting conditions, and divergent paths erupt. Now, GPT-1 had only 117 million of these parameters. By the time we got to GPT-3, this was now 175 billion. Yeah, with a B. So just by making these models bigger, we make them more chaotic and complex, which is going to drift them away from high levels of predictability, even without making them stochastic. Yes, I said without making them stochastic. Notice that on GPT-3 here, I've added an additional label, T0. That means temperature 0, and it's the key point to my whole argument. In the first video of Agentic Workshop, I explained the idea of a Turing machine and why it can be very helpful and accurate to think of an auto-regressive large language model as basically being a big version of one. What we didn't cover in that video was the steps that occur inside the machine to select the next token. This is where everyone gets confused. I'll definitely make another video in the not too distant future to explain exactly what's happening with token selection, but there's already heaps of amazing ones on YouTube if you want to understand. Check out especially the videos by 3 Blue 1 Brown. But what I need you to understand for this video is really pretty simple. When the LLM at the very end of the token generation step presents a list of possible tokens to pick and ranks them for you in terms of probability, it's what you do next that decides if your system is truly stochastic. If you roll a dice, if you generate a random number at all, and then compare the percentile result to that list in order to pick the token, then you absolutely do have a stochastic system. But if you always pick the highest probability token with no dice roll at all, you have a deterministic system. It might have calculated probabilities, but if it doesn't employ actual randomness, then it's not stochastic. When you use an LLM temperature 0, or more accurately, when you pick the argmax, or maximum probability token, you are using what's called greedy sampling, taking the biggest one every time, and you do not introduce stochasticity to the system. But if you stop just picking the top probability, if you start introducing a random selection of the token, even if you weight it heavily to the probabilities you have computed through the LLM at that point, you do two things. The first thing we found with early LLMs was that we effectively produced more interesting outputs, often more creative or more human sounding, but only within limits. If the token selection was allowed to get too random, too high in temperature, the responses collapsed and became noisy garbage. But the second thing you do when you stop greedy sampling and instead manage token selection with a stochastic function is that you fundamentally lose determinism. It's almost impossible to run the exact same setup and get the exact same result. Unpredictability goes through the roof. This isn't epistemic uncertainty, the result of errors or knowledge gaps. It's aleatory.
We are deliberately ending the calculations of our God-machine computer with a dice roll because it writes better cat memes sometimes when we do. So by now, you might be thinking, okay, JC, we get it. You don't like temperature, so just build everything in 0 temperature, yeah? Problem solved. Oh, my sweet summer child. Would that were true. Remember that idea of algorithmic non-determinism? The thing where gamma rays and weird edge case timing conditions made complex computer systems slightly less deterministic? Well, we started hitting that particular wall in a major way once we scaled even to GPT 3.5. The exact specifications of 3.5 aren't public knowledge, but two key things did change. Firstly, we introduced a new architecture which is now pretty much common to all LLMs, the mixture of experts. And second, actual baseline determinism dropped. Yes, even when on greedy sampling where we are not rolling dice. There's a pretty strong theory that these two things may be related. The mixture of experts architecture introduces more sophisticated routing of your query through the model, and that this routing introduces many more opportunities for timing collisions in the system. One could easily see intuitively how introducing more switches and gates into the flow could introduce more opportunities for algorithmic non-determinism, especially at the scale these models operate at, regardless of exactly why it happens. And yes, even top model engineers at OpenAI still aren't totally sure. As we make the models really big, we appear to be getting a type of epistemic uncertainty. Or, as I am trying to provocatively and deliberately label it, error. And yeah, then we went ahead and cranked that temperature up as well. So now we've stacked aleatory uncertainty and epistemic uncertainty. And CTOs are starting to get real nervous. Oh, and we're only at GPT 3.5.
If you were hoping we figured out whatever was going on with that epistemic uncertainty by the time we got to the next model, sorry to let you down. But that ain't where this story is going. In some ways, there's some evidence that things might have actually gotten slightly worse by the time we hit GPT 4.5. Basically, as we keep increasing the scale of these models, it's reasonable to assume that unless we start to treat the source issues causing the epistemic uncertainty, it's going to continue to rise with each iteration. The two are kind of connected. The more we make the system larger, while it still has the same intrinsic underlying error margins, the more those error margins are going to play out, particularly in a system that we've already established is itself chaotic. That is, it's really sensitive to changes in initial conditions, the sorts of changes that could be driven through error margins. So again, we jump to GPT-4, and even at temperature 0, we've now seen a curve into increasingly high levels of unpredictability. Now add again the jump in aleatory uncertainty by switching on temperature, and we've somehow managed to wind up pretty much in the extreme opposite corner, right up there, with stochastic fluid analysis. We wind up with something which is incredibly difficult to predict, but you can see how we got there through a series of steps, and that overwhelmingly, the thing which really pushes these systems directly away from determinism and deep into stochasticity is actually the decision to play with temperature, to introduce fundamentally random numbers into the selection criteria. We're definitely still getting a drift away from determinism as a result of error, but there's still a big difference between incremental statistical errors and the deliberate use of literal random number generators to introduce unpredictability in our text strings. Stepping back for a second and comparing where we began to where we wound up, you can see exactly why we wind up not just with the feeling that these LLMs are stochastic, but that they are just fundamentally unpredictable. Once we just accept routine use of high temperature and increasing error margins, we wind up so far away from the world of computer programming that it's completely reasonable and understandable that IT teams would find it incredibly frustrating when they try to build reliable business systems using this technology. Which brings us to the so what and JC's grand finale. I have fundamentally viewed my role as an architect making use of generative techniques as being one of reducing uncertainty in my system design. I'm comfortable with this because of my science background, because I'm used to systems where we're dealing continuously with a non-zero error rate. Controlling an experiment is all about accepting that there's a huge number of variables we can't control and iterating on our solution to control them, reduce them, or at least quantify them. Yet for most people in programming and in IT generally, that's not how things really work at all. We might repeatedly test something, but it's so we can isolate a single known problem like a bug or a misplaced line of code, confident that when we find it, we'll be able to make one change and everything will be fixed. That's just not how most of the rest of the world works outside of that very safe and cozy bottom right-hand corner on this quadrant. So how do we get from the far top left corner back down into the blue and maybe even the green? I believe that as people architecting this incredible and exciting new frontier of cognitive computing, our first step is to be really, really clear about when we choose to inject any amount of aleatory uncertainty. I'm not saying that you don't use temperature. In fact, we will often use temperature in our builds when we're generating things that are going to be read by another human. But there's actually a huge amount of work that goes on in building these systems at a production grade where effectively LLMs are producing outputs for other LLMs, or indeed writing outputs that will be interpreted by a good old-fashioned computer program. In those cases, you just can't convince me that there is any net benefit whatsoever to deliberately introducing stochasticity. So the first thing we can do is really challenge its use. Doing so immediately shifts the trajectory. It doesn't remove the unpredictability, but it does get rid of most of the stochasticity. And that puts us on a trajectory where we might see a path towards a more predictable outcome. Because I have a dream, and there are days where it definitely feels more dream than reality. But I do believe that there is an incredible new horizon of architectural principles and design patterns waiting to be discovered in how we harness this chaotic system we call a large language model, especially agentic systems, which are ensembles of these models operating at truly massive scales, so that we can constrain, not totally control, the extent to which they diverge from initial conditions. I believe that there are ways to harness the chaos, not by bludgeoning it into a shape it's not, but by learning to think more in curves and fractals than in straight lines and points. That might sound awfully poetic, but it's exactly how we've had to think when studying things like cellular automata and advanced chaos and complexity theories, like the three-body problem, and even things like Langton's ant. This is a field in which very clever people have been devoting their lives for many decades, and I think it's completely reasonable to expect that we can harness new techniques and new approaches to reduce the inherent chaos of the system overall, while still maintaining the very chaos that makes these models so powerful to begin with. I believe the future architectures will be about understanding emergent properties that are not themselves actually random. That's my target space for excellence in agentic systems. And I'll finish with a little nugget to help connect this back to some practical guidance. You may have heard, if you've been getting hands-on with agentic design, the phrase evals are all you need. It refers to the fact that evaluations, basically large-scale experimental tests, are essential to the successful deployment of generative technology at pretty much any scale. I couldn't agree with this more, and I actually think that it's the area that we as practitioners, especially when deploying into businesses, need to focus on and deepen our expertise in the most. But again, part of the reason why it has seemed so obvious to me is because from a scientist's perspective, that's exactly how you deal with systems like this. Again, we're not building evals like unit tests. We're building them more like samples for an experiment. Look at the 4 quadrants. It's not a perfect model, but it's a useful heuristic. Patterns of problem solving emerge. In the bottom right, deterministic, ordered systems just get calculated. The maths behaves even when the formula is gnarly. When you move up into chaos land, we literally have to iterate. It's not hard to predict because there's no way to get to the outcome. It's hard to predict because there's no way to jump to that outcome. We usually have to literally walk our way through all the possible games of chess or all the possible movements of Langton's ant in order to understand it, but we can do it. We can literally sit and work our way through all the combinations to understand the iterations of the chaotic space. In the bottom left quadrant, when things are statistical or stochastic in nature, we tend to approach it by building a statistical model. This is where an enormous amount of traditional research sits for the scientific community. And this also takes the form of doing something over and over again, collecting data on it and then performing statistics. For the most unpredictable quadrant, methods such as stochastic turbulence analysis and Monte Carlo simulation fuse both tactics, build a statistical model, then run it again and again, rolling countless virtual dice to watch emergent behavior. We already have tools for even the toughest parts of these quadrants. The challenge is bringing them into domains that have never needed this mindset. To harness these new systems, we must question the assumptions baked into traditional IT architecture. Our goal was never full determinism. It's always been useful predictability. It's hard to imagine businesses trusting these systems at scale unless we deliver reliability, our best proxy for predictability. Users can live with variability and sensitivity only if we handle the practical architecture work I mentioned.
and keep pressure on frontier labs, the teams building the models, to show we care about epistemic uncertainty. Accuracy matters, and those metrics must stay low. I'm not just talking about hallucinations or benchmark scores. The basic test is simple. When we switch off temperature and sampling tricks, does the model still give the same answer? And it's really encouraging to see that many of the frontier labs are investing in things like seed parameter control and log probabilities to help make sure we get exactly that. 2 words: reliable AI. That's the mantra, the mission, and the dream. And instead of that being some idealistic impossibility, I'm finding it to be more and more a reality in production each week. We simply cannot allow an ignorance of the maths behind these models to perpetuate a misplaced acceptance of high error margins, poor reproducibility, and unacceptably high variability. And yet it seems that this has become the majority view of what these models must be. Well, I can tell you that there are plenty of other applied enterprise AI folks like me for whom it would be simply impossible to build and deploy what we already have if that were true. So if you've just accepted this line about this technology being hopelessly non-deterministic, I hope this video has given you some hard facts on why that's not automatically true. And if you are sitting there thinking I'm insane and talking garbage, I invite you to show me the actual maths or the actual model architectures which counter anything I'm saying, because all I'm doing is explaining exactly how the models work and the choices we have when deploying them to counter the behavior everyone seems to think is the default. And if, like many of my followers and viewers, you're just trying to learn how to build reliable products with this technology, I hope this video helps you understand more about what's really going on during token selection and what tools and frameworks we need to employ in order to build these systems well. So, what are the takeaways from this? Here's JC's manifesto for what I want to see from any generative model seeking to be enterprise grade. First, we need to demand token telemetry. The supply of log probs, those token probabilities we mentioned in the video, is the current standard way to do this. But support for this feature is patchy. Anthropic still hasn't made this happen yet, and OpenAI seems to be wavering. Thankfully, Google just announced that Gemini is getting them, so this fight ain't over yet. Next up is system fingerprinting and seed control. What does that mean? Well, it's the best chance we have to observe and potentially combat the algorithmic non-determinism by giving us hash keys representing the specific micro-calibration of the server system at inference time. And in the case where we can supply a seed, it allows us to control the pseudo-random numbers generated for token selection. Again, removing a variable to outputs. Finally, I want to see benchmarks on determinism and control taken seriously again. Honestly, I can't get over how little focus this is getting in the benchmark reporting, and that needs to change. So log probes, fingerprints, and seeds, and strong reliability benchmarks. If we don't demand them as enterprise consumers, they won't be prioritized. Regardless of your point of view, though, thank you for listening to mine. Respectful dialogue on this and many other issues in generative AI is simply essential if we're going to steer its trajectory prudently, competently, and collectively. See you on the next hill.